My name is Nina, and I never thought I'd be telling this story. I grew up in a world of privilege, the only child of Robert and Elizabeth Collins. My father was a self-made man, having built his business empire from the ground up. He was stern but loving, always pushing me to be my best. My mother, on the other hand, was the epitome of grace and sophistication, moving through high society circles with ease. Our family lived in a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city. I had everything a girl could want: the best education, designer clothes, exotic vacations. But despite all the material comforts, there was always a part of me that felt empty. Enter Mark Johnson. I met him during my final year of college, and it was like a bolt of lightning struck me. He was charming, handsome, and seemed to understand me in a way no one else ever had. We started dating, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly alive. There was just one problem: my parents hated him. "Nina, darling," my mother said one evening over dinner, "don't you think Mark is attracted to you not only by your inner qualities, but also by our money?" My father chimed in, his face set in a hard frown. "He's got no prospects, no ambition. He's not the kind of man who can give you the life you're accustomed to." "I don't care about any of that," I shouted, pushing away from the table. "I love him, and he loves me. Isn't that what matters?" Things came to a head when Mark proposed. It was a simple affair, no fancy restaurant, no elaborate setup. Just the two of us, walking in the park where we had our first date. He got down on one knee, pulled out a modest ring, and asked me to be his wife. I said yes without hesitation. When I told my parents, all hell broke loose. "If you marry him, you're no longer welcome in this house," my father roared. "Daddy, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Can't you just be happy for me?" But he wouldn't budge. My mother stood silently by his side, her face a mask of disappointment. I left that night, my heart breaking but my resolve firm. I moved in with Mark, into the small apartment he shared with a roommate. It was a far cry from the luxury I was used to, but I was determined to make it work. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of planning and stress. I kept hoping my parents would come around, that they'd realize how much their presence meant to me. But as the big day approached, it became clear they weren't going to change their minds. As I walked down the aisle, I scanned the faces of our guests, still holding out hope that I'd see my parents. But they weren't there. For a moment, sadness threatened to overwhelm me. Then I saw Mark, standing at the altar, looking at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. In that moment, everything else faded away. My parents' absence, the modest surroundings, the uncertain future, none of it mattered. I was marrying the man I loved, and that was enough. After the wedding, Mark and I moved into the luxury apartment in the city center that my beloved grandfather had left me. It was a stark contrast to Mark's old place, spacious, with high ceilings, and a view of the city skyline. I spent days decorating it, trying to make it feel like our home. As the days turned into weeks and then months, we settled into married life. Mark threw himself into his work at a local marketing firm, often coming home late but always with a smile and a kiss for me. I busied myself with setting up our home and volunteering at a local animal shelter. About a year and a half after our wedding, our lives changed forever. I still remember the day I found out I was pregnant. My hands were shaking as I held the positive test, a mix of excitement and terror coursing through me. When I told Mark, his face lit up like a Christmas tree. "We're going to be parents," he exclaimed, picking me up and spinning me around. "Nina, this is amazing." When our son, Jacob, was born, I was overwhelmed with love. He was perfect, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a shock of dark hair, just like his father's. Through the haze of exhaustion and joy, I snapped a picture of him and sent it to my parents. I waited for a response. A call, a text, anything. But there was nothing but silence. "They'll come around," Mark assured me, seeing the hurt in my eyes. How could they resist this little guy? I tried to push the disappointment aside and focus on our new family. A few months after Jacob was born, I decided it was time for me to get back to work. I found a part-time position as a manager at a local boutique. Balancing work, a newborn, and keeping the house in order was a challenge, but I was determined to make it work. I'd wake up early to feed Jacob, drop him off at daycare, work my shift, pick him up, make dinner, clean the house, and collapse into bed, only to do it all over again the next day. But as Jacob neared his first birthday, I started to notice changes in Mark. He became more distant, often coming home even later than before. When he was home, he seemed distracted, always on his phone. "Everything okay at work?" I asked one night as we got ready for bed. "Yeah, just busy," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "Big project coming up." As I drifted off to sleep that night, Jacob's soft breathing coming through the baby monitor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I pushed it aside. We were happy, weren't we? We had a beautiful son, a lovely home, good jobs. What more could I want? The changes in Mark became more pronounced as time went on. One evening, as I was putting Jacob to bed, Mark cornered me in the nursery. "Mina, we need to talk," he said, his tone unusually serious. "I think you should quit your job." I blinked, sure I had misheard him. "Quit my job? Why?" "Look around," he gestured vaguely. "The house is a mess. Jacob needs more attention. I think it would be better if you focused on being a full-time mom and housewife." I felt like I'd been slapped. But I love my job. And I thought we were managing just fine. Mark's face hardened. "Well, we're not. I'm the man of this house, and I'm telling you, it's time to quit." We argued late into the night, but in the end, I gave in. I told myself it was for the good of our family, that Mark was just stressed from work. The next day, with a heavy heart, I handed in my resignation. At first, I threw myself into my new role with gusto. I deep cleaned the apartment, tried new recipes, and spent hours playing with Jacob. But as the days wore on, I found myself missing the structure and satisfaction of my job. Meanwhile, Mark's behavior continued to change. He started coming home later and later, often smelling of alcohol. Our bank account, which I had access to, showed mysterious withdrawals. One night, as I was folding laundry, I confronted him. "Mark, where is all our money going? We're barely making ends meet." He exploded. "Maybe if you knew how to budget properly, we wouldn't have this problem." I recoiled, shocked at his outburst. This wasn't the man I married. Things only got worse from there. Mark began criticizing everything I did. The house was never clean enough, dinner was never good enough, I wasn't attentive enough to Jacob. The final straw came when Jacob got sick with a nasty flu. He was running a high fever and crying constantly. I was at my wit's end, having been up for 2 nights straight. "Mark, please," I begged. "Can you take a day off work to help me with Jacob? I'm exhausted." He looked at me like I was crazy. "Take a day off? Are you kidding? Some of us actually have to work for a living, Mina." The next day, he came home with a suitcase. "I'm going to a hotel for a few days," he announced. "I need to rest after work, not listen to a screaming kid." I was stunned. "You're leaving us? Now?" He shrugged, already heading for the door. "Taking care of Jacob is your job, not mine. Call me when he's better." As the door slammed behind him, I sank to the floor, Jacob wailing in my arms. What had happened to us? To the man who had once looked at me like I hung the moon? In that moment, I missed my parents more than ever. I wanted to call them, to hear my mother's soothing voice, to feel my father's protective embrace. But pride and shame held me back. How could I admit that they had been right all along? As I rocked Jacob, trying to soothe both his cries and my own, I couldn't help but think about the words my father had said on the day I told them about my engagement. "He's not the man you think he is, Nina." The days following Mark's departure to the hotel were a blur of sleepless nights and exhausting days. Jacob's fever finally broke, and as his health improved, I found myself with more time to think, perhaps too much time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in my marriage. The man who had returned from the hotel was not the Mark I had fallen in love with. He was distant, irritable, and seemed to resent both Jacob and me. One evening, about a week after he'd returned, Mark came home earlier than usual. His face was serious, and he was clutching some papers. "Mina, we need to talk about insurance," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I've taken out a life insurance policy on myself for $1 million. I think you should do the same." The amount made my head spin. $1 million? Mark, that seems excessive. And why do I need such a large policy? I don't even work outside the home anymore. His eyes hardened. "It's for Jacob's future. In case anything happens to either of us. Don't you want to make sure he's taken care of?" Put that way, I couldn't argue. Still, something about the whole situation felt off. "I suppose you're right," I said slowly. "If you think it's best." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I'll set up the appointment with the insurance agent." Over the next few days, I noticed Mark's behavior becoming even stranger. He was constantly on his phone, texting at all hours. Whenever it rang, he'd leave the room to answer, often locking himself in our home office. One morning, after Mark left for work, I made a decision. I couldn't live with this uncertainty anymore. I needed answers. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd found online. "Hawkeye Private Investigations, how can I help you?" a gruff voice answered. I took a deep breath. I need someone to follow my husband. I think he might be." I couldn't bring myself to say the words, but the investigators seemed to understand. "I see, ma'am. Why don't you come into our office and we can discuss the details?" That afternoon, while Jacob was napping, I met with the investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Linda. I told her everything, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the drastic personality change. Linda listened intently, taking notes. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Mrs. Johnson. I'll have my best guy on it." As I left her office, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Part of me hoped this was all a misunderstanding, that there was a reasonable explanation for Mark's behavior. But a larger part knew that whatever the investigator uncovered was likely to change my life forever. 3 weeks after hiring the private investigator, I received the call I had been both dreading and anticipating. "Mrs. Johnson, we have the report ready," Linda's voice came through the phone. "You might want to sit down for this." With trembling hands, I sank into a chair, my heart pounding. "I'm ready. Tell me everything." As Linda spoke, I felt my world crumbling around me. Mark, my husband, the father of my child, had been unfaithful. He had a mistress. The evidence was irrefutable: photographs, text messages, hotel receipts. It was all there in black and white. I waited until Mark left for work the next morning before springing into action. With shaking hands, I packed a bag for myself and Jacob, throwing in only the essentials. Clothes, diapers, a few of Jacob's favorite toys. I couldn't bear to look at the photos on the walls, the happy memories that now felt like lies. "We're going to see Grandma and Grandpa," I cooed to Jacob as I put him in the stroller. He giggled, oblivious to the turmoil around him. I decided to take the metro to my parents' house. It would be faster than driving through rush hour traffic. As I approached the station, my mind was racing, planning our next steps. That's when it happened. I was crossing the street, pushing Jacob in his stroller, when suddenly there was a screech of tires. I turned my head and saw a car hurtling towards us. In a split second, I pushed the stroller out of the way. Then, pain. Blinding, all-consuming pain. And then, darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally opened my eyes, I was in a hospital room. The steady beep of machines filled the air. And there, sitting by my bed, looking haggard and worried, was Mark. "Jacob," I croaked, my throat dry. "Where's Jacob?" Mark leaned forward, taking my hand. "He's fine, Nina. He's with Lisa, your best friend. Not a scratch on him. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a wave of pain. I looked down at my legs, both encased in casts. You have multiple fractures in both legs, Mark explained gently. The doctors say it'll take about a year for you to fully recover. You'll need to use a wheelchair for a while. I closed my eyes, trying to process this information. A year. A wheelchair. And then, like a bolt of lightning, I remembered why I had been at that metro station in the first place. I know about her, I blurted out, my eyes snapping open to gauge Mark's reaction. Your mistress. I know everything. Mark's face paled. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it. Then his shoulders slumped. Nina, it wasn't serious. It was a stupid mistake, he stammered. When I got the call about your accident, I realized how close I came to losing you. I can't lose you, Nina. Please, can we start over? Give me another chance. I'll do better, I promise. I looked at him, this man I had loved for so long. He seemed so sincere, so remorseful. And I was so tired, so overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Okay, I heard myself say. We can try. The day I was discharged from the hospital was surreal. Mark arrived with a bouquet of my favorite flowers, pink peonies. His smile seemed genuine, his eyes filled with concern and love. As he wheeled me out of the hospital, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could make this work after all. The first 2 weeks at home were, surprisingly nice. Mark was attentive, caring, almost doting. He helped me with everything, from getting dressed to bathing. He'd carry me to the bathroom in his arms, careful not to jostle my injured legs. It reminded me of our early days together, when every touch felt electric. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Mark turned to me with a glint in his eye. Nina, I've been thinking, he said, taking my hand. We should get away for a weekend. Just the two of us. To celebrate your recovery and, well, us. My heart skipped a beat. Really? Where? I found this cozy little house in the mountains, overlooking a beautiful canyon. What do you say? I couldn't help but smile. That sounds wonderful. But what about Jacob? And I'm in a wheelchair. I'm sure Lisa wouldn't mind watching him for a couple of days. About the wheelchair. If anything, I'll carry you in my arms. Come on, it'll be good for us. I agreed, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This could be exactly what we needed to reconnect. The drive to the mountains was peaceful. As we wound our way up the narrow road, I felt the tension of the past months slowly melting away. The house, when we arrived, was everything Mark had promised, cozy, secluded, with breathtaking views of the canyon. I'm going to explore a bit, Mark said after we'd settled in. Why don't you rest? I nodded, watching him disappear down a trail. Left alone, I decided to check my emails. I hadn't had a chance to do so since the accident. My phone was nowhere to be found, so I wheeled myself over to Mark's laptop. As I opened the browser, an email notification popped up. It was from an unfamiliar address, but the subject line made my blood run cold. Urgent, new information about your case. With trembling hands, I clicked on it. The message was from Linda, the private investigator I'd hired weeks ago. My heart pounded as I read. Mrs. Johnson, I've been trying to reach you. Your number is out of service. I've uncovered disturbing new information. You're in danger. Your husband was involved in your accident. He's trying to get rid of you for the insurance money and your apartment. His mistress was driving the car that hit you. I've attached evidence, photos, videos, texts. Please contact me immediately. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. There was Mark, plotting with his mistress. There were bank statements showing large withdrawals. There was a grainy video of a woman who looked remarkably like Mark's assistant behind the wheel of a car, moments before impact. Just as I closed the laptop, Mark walked in. I tried to compose myself, but my heart was racing. Everything okay, Nina? He asked, his voice deceptively casual. I forced a smile. Yeah, I can't find my phone. Have you seen it? A cold smile played on Mark's lips. Oh, that. It broke down suddenly. Must have been damaged in the accident. A chill ran down my spine. I needed to contact someone, anyone, but how? Mark, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Could I borrow your phone? I want to check on Jacob, see how he's doing with Lisa. He hesitated for a moment, then handed me his phone. Sure, go ahead. I'll just be right here. My hands trembled as I took the phone. Mark hovered nearby, watching. I knew I couldn't call the police or even Lisa. Then, a memory flashed in my mind, a conversation with my father years ago. If you're ever in trouble and can't speak freely, ask about Buddy the bear. I'll know you need help. Praying my father hadn't changed his number, I dialed. When he answered, I put on my brightest voice. Hey, Lisa. How's everything going? How's Buddy the bear doing? There was a pause, and I held my breath. Then my father's voice came through, deliberately high-pitched to sound feminine. Oh, you know, same old, same old. How are you? Relief washed over me. He understood. Oh, it's lovely up here, I gushed, aware of Mark's eyes on me. We're at this beautiful cabin, 1247 Pine Ridge Road. The view of Evergreen Canyon is just stunning. I see, my father said carefully. When do you think you'll be back? Oh, I dream of seeing you right now, this very second. I said emphatically. I miss you guys already. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, I hung up. Mark seemed satisfied, not suspecting anything amiss. As evening approached, Mark suggested a walk. The sunset over the canyon is beautiful. We shouldn't miss it. Fear gripped me, but I knew I had no choice. That sounds nice, I managed to say. Mark wheeled me out onto a narrow path that wound along the edge of the canyon. The view was breathtaking, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, the canyon stretching endlessly before us, but all I could think about was the sheer drop just feet away. As Mark pushed my wheelchair, chatting about the scenery as if everything was normal, I closed my eyes and prayed. Please, Dad, I thought desperately. Please find me in time. The path curved one last time, and suddenly we were at the edge of the cliff. Mark turned my chair around, and our eyes met. The loving facade he'd maintained crumbled away, revealing a stranger with eyes full of anger and hatred. You know, Nina, he said, his voice cold and detached. I'm really sorry it had to come to this. The car accident was supposed to take care of everything, but you just had to survive, didn't you? My blood ran cold as the full truth of my situation hit me. Mark, please, I whispered, don't do this. He laughed mirthlessly. Do you have any idea how perfect this is? A tragic accident at a scenic overlook. Your wheelchair rolls off the edge when the brakes fail. I'll be the grieving widower, inherit your apartment, and cash in that $1 million insurance policy. It's foolproof. As he spoke, he inched my wheelchair closer to the edge. I closed my eyes, silently praying for a miracle. Suddenly, I heard shouts and running footsteps. My eyes flew open to see my father sprinting down the path, followed closely by several police officers. Nina, my father yelled, reaching us just as Mark was about to push me over. He grabbed the handles of my wheelchair, yanking me back from the brink. Everything happened in a blur after that. The police tackled Mark to the ground, reading him his rights as they handcuffed him. I sat there, shaking, as the reality of what had almost happened washed over me. My father knelt beside my wheelchair, pulling me into a tight embrace. I broke down, sobbing into his shoulder. I'm so sorry, Dad, I choked out between sobs. You were right about him. I should have listened to you. He stroked my hair gently, his own voice thick with emotion. No, sweetheart. I'm the one who should be sorry. We let our pride keep us apart. Can you forgive us for not being there for you and Jacob? I nodded, unable to speak through my tears. We stayed like that for a long moment, years of hurt and misunderstanding melting away. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. I filed for divorce, and with the overwhelming evidence against him, Mark was sentenced to prison for attempted murder, along with his mistress who had driven the car in the original accident. I sold the apartment that held so many painful memories and bought a new one, close to a good school for Jacob and just a few blocks from my parents' house. I moved back in with my parents during my rehabilitation. It was a year of healing, both physically and emotionally. My parents doted on Jacob, making up for lost time with their grandson. Slowly, I learned to trust again, to smile again, to hope again.